Well, hi everyone, and welcome to That OA Thing. I'm Donald Gallagher, the Chief Executive of the Ombudsman Association, and we're thrilled to have you back for episode 2 of the second season of our podcast. As some of you may know, the OA not only covers the UK and Ireland, but also the British Overseas Territories. And I'm delighted that we're joined today by Michael DeSilva, the Ombudsman for Bermuda. Today, we're going to get Michael's reflections on the sector and the similarities and differences between different jurisdictions. Thanks for joining us, Michael. It's great to have you on.
Hi, Donald. Thanks for having me.
First of all, just to provide some context for our listeners, could you just give a brief overview of the role of your office and its jurisdiction?
Sure. I think it might be helpful just to explain just a little bit about Bermuda itself. So Bermuda is a self-governing British overseas territory. There are 14 UK overseas territories. We are the largest by population, not by landmass. We're 54 square kilometers and a population of 65,000. So think maybe a town like Basingstoke, although that town is 10 times bigger than we are in terms of land mass. We are literally an island in the middle of nowhere. We're in the Atlantic Ocean, about 1,200 kilometers east of North Carolina in the States, and 1,500 kilometers northeast of the Bahamas. So we're not in the Caribbean. We're not part of America. We're just isolated out in the ocean. Our office is the classic ombudsman or the parliamentary ombudsman. So our jurisdiction is to investigate complaints of maladministration against government departments. And that includes any entity that's funded by the Bermuda government. So government boards, public authorities, and some charities actually fall in that umbrella as well. We don't have an organizational ombudsman scheme in Bermuda like you do in the UK. So furniture ombudsman, financial ombudsman, auto ombudsman. We don't have that. We do have a Bermuda department, Chamber of Commerce department, and they take complaints on the private sector. But interestingly, their office also falls in our jurisdiction. So sometimes we have oversight of private matters in that respect. In the grand scheme of things, our office is relatively new. We were formed in 2005 with the first ombudsman. So in the last 19 years, we've had 3. I'm the third one. I've been in post for 2 years now. And we're a pretty small office. There's myself. We have a deputy ombudsman, 2 investigators, and then 2 support staff, 1 on the finance side and 1 on the admin side.
That's really helpful, especially the geography as well. I was briefly looking at the maps on my wall behind me just to go, oh yeah, there it is. That was helpful. You referred to Bermuda being a small jurisdiction and that point about an island. Would you say there's particular challenges or opportunities that presents that might be different to those your ombudsman colleagues might face in larger countries?
I would probably say the same thing that other colleagues would say. We don't have enough staff. That's what everyone says because everyone, knows that they could do more with more. The difference for us is that we don't have the scalability that you might find in a larger office. So we have, of the 6 staff, only 4 are managing the casework. So that's it. We can't peel off a team to go and deal with a specific issue. Like if we have a backlog, we can't say, okay, you 6, go work on the backlog for the next 3 months. We don't have 6 to start with, and we only have, and the 4 we have are doing all of the casework. So backlog is a bit tricky to try and tackle. And the other one is special reports. So we have the ability to investigate on our own motion. So where there's no complaint, but we see an issue that we think is of significant public interest, we can initiate our own investigation. And that's normally that's a formal deal, and it requires a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of resources. And again, that's the problem that we face. We've got the same 4 people that we're throwing at all the different jobs that we do. So we don't have that ability to sort of scale up and scale down in response to the demand. And I think the other problem is we don't have a like agency to collaborate with. We have similar agencies. So we have a privacy commissioner who oversees data protection. We have an information commissioner who's all about freedom of information and records from public agencies. We've got a human rights commission that investigates complaints of human rights violations, but they're all quite narrow in their field, whereas we are sort of generalist. We deal with something like 150 authorities, from planning department to the transport department to the health department. And there's just such a wide array of complaints in terms of the complexity, in terms of the subject that they deal with. And there's no one else to talk about with that. So we rely on our relationships with colleagues overseas to sort of bounce things off or get a different perspective, or find out how other offices have solved the same problem that we face.
That's interesting. It's quite often you'll hear colleagues talking about being an ombudsman being quite a lonely job, no matter where you're based, because
Yeah.
it's quite often you against the sector. But I think what's coming across here is that perhaps more literal at times in the position you're in. As you know, Michael, from some of the conversations you've been involved in with the association, outreach has been identified by all of our members as one of their key priorities, regardless of which sector or nation or territory they operate in. How are you taking forward that in Bermuda, that issue, and what challenges do you face in doing that?
So, I mean, outreach to the community just seems like the right thing to do when you're in this sort of public service arena. But for me, there's a bit more science behind it, and it really starts with this whole world of performance management. Performance management has been around for a long time. People have written endless books on it and university theses and all sorts. And it's based on this premise of what gets measured gets done. So its starting point is, if it's important, then measure it. The difficulty, the challenge, I think, with performance measurement, performance management, is it can get a little bit too technical, especially in our industry. So when we start to focus too much on how long does it take to complete an intake, how long does it take to complete an investigation, what's the response time on this, those are easy things to measure because they're linear, but they don't necessarily tell you if you're doing a good job or not. They talk about efficiency, but they don't talk about impact. So when I started in the office 2 years ago, we raised this concept of impact. What we're really here to do is help people solve their problems when they come up against an issue with the government department. We don't always solve it in their favor, but we should try to resolve it as best we can for the circumstances. And so how fast we answer intake is less important than what difference did we make in the person's life. And that's a bit more difficult to measure because you have to ask people, how do you feel? And that can get a bit tricky. And I'll talk about in a second an experience that I had where someone else had solved that problem. And I was talking about that before. So once we realize that, we've got to start surveying people to get a sense of how well we're doing. Like, how's my driving? How am I doing? And so we launched a strategic plan last year. Community outreach is a huge plank in that. And we're trying to achieve two things with community outreach. So the first one is, what impact are we making? Did we make a difference to the complainant? Were we accessible? Were we responsive? Did we act fairly and impartial? Were we independent? And none of those are about how fast we do anything. That's all about the quality of how we're doing it. And the second part, or the second thing we're trying to achieve, and the second objective of community outreach, is make sure people know what you do. Because it would be a travesty if there is someone in the community who has a problem with the government department, they're being treated unfairly, and they don't know where to go. So we started to do some informal surveys. We did some man in the street, women in the street interviews. And what we discovered was that the members of the public who had heard of us or come to us, they thought we were doing a good job. The difficulty was we weren't well known in the community. So most people would say, yeah, I've heard of you, but I actually don't know what you do. And so we realized we've got to change that. We've got to get into the community and get our message out there. And it also means getting into communities that might be underserved, underrepresented. And what sort of drives my curiosity is, I don't know what I don't know. because I don't know it yet. So I don't know, for example, in the Filipino community. So we have a guest worker population from the Philippines. We have Europeans. We have people from all over the world. And I've heard anecdotally that some Asian communities are reluctant to complain because it's a cultural issue around embarrassing their families and things like that. But I don't know. I won't know until I go to the Filipino community and I say, this is what we do. This is the type of service we provide. And if there are any barriers from you using that service, how can we help to remove the barrier? But we can't wait for people to come to us. We have to put the message out there. So we're doing public presentations to community groups, to charities, to businesses, to anybody really that wants to hear from us. And we're doing these pop-ups where we just put a tent out in the street and, grab people off the sidewalk and give them a free pen if they'll do our survey and things like that. And we've also engaged with a small marketing agency to raise our social media profile. And all of that is having an impact. But there are two cautions that come with that. And the first one is finding a balance of managing people's expectation. So we are trying to advertise our services, but we don't want to sound like an ambulance chasing lawyer. We don't want to get out there and say, hey, you got a problem with government? Come to us. We'll champion your cause, because we don't do that. We don't represent clients. We represent fairness. We don't defend authorities. We examine their response to see if it's in line with policy and law. So we don't want to overcook it so that people think we're some type of agencies that will get them whatever they want. The other challenge for us, going back to the small office, is we don't have a section that does community outreach or a public education officer or anyone that's got nothing else to do that we can put on that. So we're using the same resources, the same investigative resources. We're using them to go out and do these presentations. And it's a huge investment in time. It's well worth the investment, but it is a huge investment. And what it means is that when investigators are doing community outreach, they're not doing casework. And so that's the other balance that we have to try and find.
That's really interesting, and that point about the language you were saying and avoiding coming across like ambulance chasing, it just immediately made me think of when we have gatherings with international colleagues that in the Spanish speaking world, rather than ombudsman, they use Defensor del Pueblo, defender of the people. So again, just that image of what are you actually there for? Are you championing or are you fairness? And I think when you crack that, I think a lot of other colleagues are going to be interested to see how do you find that balance. I think on that note, as you're aware, one of the things that the OA is shortly going to be launching for members is an outreach network to share these experiences and challenges and best practice, as we already have networks, around things like casework or communications or HR. So if I can ask you a bit of a loaded question, what do you see the benefits are of being a member of the OA?
So not to use an overused management term, but I think the answer is networking. It really is. And what that really means is the ability to reach out to a group of friends, because the whole point of networking is get to know people, put names to faces, have conversations before you need them. And so when you reach out, you're reaching out into a friendly atmosphere to say, I have a problem, I've experienced an issue, and chances are someone out there has the same problem or has already solved the problem or is trying to solve the problem. And you just have that multiplier effect. So you can either just get something that someone's already done. And I'll give you an example of that. So I joined the office 2 years ago. I've been to 2 OA conferences. The first conference, I met Margaret Kelly. She's the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman. We were talking about impact, and we were talking about how I recognized that I needed to survey the public because we don't know what we don't know. We have no idea what the public thinks of us. And this is just in conversation. And she said, we just finished commissioning a bunch of survey questions from our local university. And you can have them if you want. And so there you are. And I learned a long time ago in another profession. I learned how to borrow with pride, and say thank you very much, and scratch off Northern Ireland at the top and put Bermuda Ombudsman across the top. But that's the whole point of this industry. This is a public service. So the better we get at our job, the more the public benefits, and not just members of the public. It's also the the public offices, the people that work in the public authorities. They can get better at their job, or we can make a recommendation that makes life easier for them or makes their service better. So sharing ideas with colleague ombudsmen for the betterment of the public and the people that serve the public has got to be an honorable pursuit. The other quick example, so the second conference that I attended, I met Paul Conroy. He's the director of intake and assessment for the local government and social care ombudsman. And same thing. So we were talking about how my office had just done an ad hoc, we called it a roundtable, and we just invited random public authorities to send whoever they wanted who might deal with our office, so that we could have this discussion about how the relationship should work between the ombudsman's office and the public authority. We're not here to beat you up. We're not here to embarrass you. We're here to make an independent assessment of whether or not your decision or your action was the right one for the circumstances. And if it wasn't, we're going to make a recommendation that could improve it, and sort of just take the edge off this sort of watchdog. I don't think that's what we are. We're not a watchdog. We don't have that sort of role to play, as much as we have an independent dispute resolution body that solves the problem and potentially makes the service better. And so I said, we just had this, and it went well, and I'm inclined to do another one. And he said, oh, well, we've got an online program, and we do in-person training as well. It's a one-day seminar. We do a certificate at the end of it. And so here's a body that had already sold this whole thing. They've got the slides, they've got the program, the agenda, the objectives, they've got the material, and we're discussing now how we can use that to sort of change our roundtable discussion into something a little more formal. Maybe not a certificate program, but maybe a full day seminar where we have a program of activity to go through, so that not only does the authority understand what we do, but we understand what the authority does, because I think that's important as well. We've got over 100 government departments, plus a bunch of other authorities on top of that. And we're not experts. We don't do their job on a daily basis. So it's important that we listen to them before we start investigating complaints, so we actually understand what they do and how they do it and why they do it.
It's great to hear that networking is, as you say, has been such a positive experience. We've just had our 2024 conference, but I feel like we need to snip this up and put it out as promotional material of the benefits of coming to the OA conference and networking. So it's great to hear that you've taken something positive from both of those. I guess one last question I wanted to pose to you, which again is a bit of a funny one in some ways, but what would you say is the best thing about being the Ombudsman for Bermuda in particular, and is there anything you're particularly proud of that the office has done?
Well, I think the best thing for me personally is that I was born and raised here, and before I had this job, I had a career in public service in the police service. And so for my whole life, I've worked in public service, and this position provided a unique opportunity in sort of semi-retirement to come back and continue my work in public service. So that's hugely rewarding to me personally. I think more generally, having complained that we're small and we're remote and we're in the middle of nowhere and we don't have enough staff, there's a certain charm to that. There's a certain charm to sort of knowing your community by name, by face, having a close working relationship with your team. And I have the best team. They are dedicated and supportive, and they come to work to help people. every day. So it's a joy to be part of the team. And part of the charm with the wider community is there's a personal touch. People come into the office and invariably they know one of us, and you have a conversation about cousins and uncles and how's your nana doing and things like that. And it just makes it more personal. Or you see people in the supermarket and on the street, or at a public event. It does tend to take up a lot of time, because when you're at the supermarket, you just want to pick up a few things and go, and someone corners you and they start sort of peppering you with questions about their case, and you're like, I can't really talk about it here. You do have to manage that. But there is a sort of small town charm to being in a community like this. In terms of, and the other thing I like about a small office is I can actually manage a caseload. So I'm not just the administrator. I don't just sit in the office and have meetings and do reports. I actually manage my own caseload. I take complaints. I write investigation reports, and I'm actively involved with the investigators in all the cases that we have. So that just from a fulfillment perspective, I feel very fulfilled that I'm doing the work and not just sort of some figurehead. In terms of what I'm proud of, so we talked about special report. So that's where we don't have a complainant, but we have an issue that we think is of general public interest. We can make that report public, and I'm just about to release one on this Friday, the 28th of June. It has to go to the House of Assembly before it can be made public. But by the time this podcast comes out, it will already be public. And I would encourage people to go to our website at ombudsman.bm. We're easy to find because we're the only one in Bermuda, if you just Google that. But this is an investigation into the release of spent criminal convictions, or convictions that have been expired by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. And generally, certain offenses cannot be released if they're more than 7 years old. But there are some exceptions to that. And one of the exceptions is where the applicant gives consent to release it. And there's a set of circumstances where the U.S. consulate operating under the State Department, who deal with U.S. visa applications for immigration, they have a requirement where they ask for all of your records, not just the ones that are current. They want the ones that are spent as well. So there was some confusion whether applicants knew that. And so we investigated it. And long story short, what we concluded was it wasn't very clear if the applicants were clear. So we've made a recommendation that would cut through that just by including it in the application form with a signature that said, I consent to the release of this record. And that would alleviate any doubt whether or not the person knew. And it also gives them the option up front for them to say, well, actually, I don't want to release that record, and I think I'll withdraw my application from the U.S. visa program. It's not the best choice, but it's still a choice that they can make. Whereas right now there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding, and we're not entirely convinced that people are aware that their old convictions will be released.
Well, I think talking about success is always a good note to leave it on. So I think that's a natural point for us. But I just wanted to again say thank you, Michael, for joining us today and sharing your reflections.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And to you, dear listeners, thank you for joining us again. Do please share with your colleagues. Stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Threads under the name Ombudsman Association. And hopefully you'll join us again next time.